Welcome to Wine Blast. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here, Susie.
Now, we've just done a Valentine's podcast, and we asked people how and when they first fell in love with wine. We had some lovely stories, and I just wanted to ask, what is yours? When did you get into wine? How and why?
Well, there have been many memorable bottles. I think perhaps the first one was a Brunello that my husband and I tasted at an Italian restaurant, but I also have the memory of this magical Rhone Valley Syrah. We had rented a cabin. That was our version of camping. That's as much as I was going to do camping wise. But and this storm was blowing across the lake in front of the cabin, and I just remember like the windows were rattling, and the rain was hitting the tin roof, and it was coming down the fireplace and sizzling in the fire. And then we opened up this Rhone, this smoky Rhone, full-bodied wine, and we were drinking it in front of the fireplace. And I thought, it can rain forever. I don't care. And the more the wind whipped across the lake and the harder it rained, the more I loved that Rhone. It just filled all my senses, and it was a magical evening. I'll never forget that wine.
I think sometimes Rhone wines really can be overlooked and underestimated, but we'd certainly say, yeah, the Northern Rhone is one of our favourite areas for red wine. So that was how you that was your kind of moment. Now, one of our very first podcasts was how wine can be a career or a second career. What would you say to people who maybe love wine and are intrigued by it and are just wondering if they could make a career or a second career, like you did, out of it?
Absolutely. Explore it. I think sometimes folks think, oh, I love this as a hobby. Could I get paid for it? And there are so many possibilities to do that, as you know, Susie. You and I and Peter have made a living by being writers or commentators, but there's lots of careers out there: tour guides, tasting room personnel, being a winemaker. It's there's lots of possibilities. I think what it comes down to is you have to think, what do I love? What skills do I have? And what do I enjoy aside from drinking wine? And marry those skills up to the skills needed for a particular career, because it's one thing to love wine, and it's a great thing, but you also need to ensure that you have the skills that would be a fit for one of the many careers that are in wine.
So continuing sort of on that theme, what would you say, given you moved into wine as a second career, what's been the biggest regret of your
Hmm.
career
Yes,
so
well,
far?
absolutely. When I got started, before I even jumped into wine, I didn't have the confidence to go to journalism school. I loved writing. That was my passion, as a going through elementary school and so on. But I just didn't have the confidence to think I could ever get paid to write. And so I didn't go to journalism school. Instead, I got very practical, and got an MBA. We talked about this a little bit on when I interviewed on you folks on my podcast, Susie. I think there are similar notions that as a woman, you feel you need the credential, in your case, a master of wine, in my case, an MBA, to always know that I could be financially independent, could get a good job, and so on. So I was raised by a single mother in Nova Scotia, small town, and she really taught me the importance of being financially independent. So I don't regret doing the MBA, but I just wished I'd had the confidence to go for that journalism degree as an undergrad.
And on a slightly more positive note, then, what's been your high point, the real high point for you?
Well, I think getting past that mental block as a woman. So I think sometimes, I know personally, and women friends have told me, we often discount ourselves out of a job before we even apply for it. And I know I'm generalizing, but when I went off on maternity leave, d- for the birth of my son about 20 years ago, I wasn't writing, but I'd taken a sommelier diploma program. I knew I loved writing from my job, and I thought, you know what? I'm just going to take a flyer. I'm going to take a chance and pitch an article about wine on the internet to a local magazine. So instead of like saying, oh no, I could not do that, maybe it was just maternity brain that actually made me take that leap. But I was so glad that I did, because that led to my career in writing about wine. And that's why, often when I talk with women, take a chance, even if you don't have all the credentials or everything lined up, just try it and see where it might lead.
If you never give it a go, it's never going to happen, is it?
Exactly.
So before we talk a bit more about you, which I obviously want to do, I'd love to just ask you about Canada and Canadian wine. You're speaking to us now from Ottawa in Ontario. Now, Voltaire rather unkindly described Canada as a few acres of snow. But I'd
Yes.
like to know how you would describe the country and its wine industry.
Sure. Well, Voltaire, my hat's off to him. He certainly was great in philosophy, but I wouldn't trust him as a travel guide because no one would ever visit us. Um, so, yes, indeed, we do have lots of snow here, but you learn to embrace the weather wherever you are, I think, or else you're just miserable. Personally, I enjoy the great indoors, as I like to tell Miles, my partner. And so rather than being outside skiing and snowshoeing and all the rest of it, I like to have the drinks ready for when everyone comes back from those activities. So I still love where we are. But in terms of the wine industry, that cool climate has a profound effect on the type of wines that we produce. And so our industry is relatively small, perhaps like the English wine industry. We have about 700 wineries right now, and we have about 31,000 acres of vines planted. Our major regions are Ontario, BC,
This
and
has
we
grown quite
yeah,
a lot recently, hasn't it? Just
it has,
in
it
the last sort
has.
of 30 years, would you say?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And even in the last 5 years, the growth has been phenomenal. It seems like every week we hear about a new winery opening in Niagara or the Okanagan.
And
Of course,
is that to do with climate change and just everything? I mean, we know it's a cold country. Goodness me, England is cold. We know about cold countries, but do you think that it's having an effect and a positive effect?
think it is. Like, for instance, the 2020 vintage was the hottest ever here, and that's happening in a lot of wine regions. It was hot and it was dry. And so the red wines that we produce struggle to produce here, especially the full-bodied ones like Cabernet, ripened beautifully, and it's going to be a banner vintage for big reds. But at the same time, the ice wine harvest, for which we're famous, dropped 30% because winemakers decided not to make ice wine, or it didn't get cold enough. At Confluence, of course, COVID has affected duty-free sales in airports, so that's where you buy a lot of your ice wine. But certainly, climate change is impacting the decisions, not just about new wineries opening up, but which grapes we're planting and what types of wine we're making here.
So, I mean, we don't see nearly enough Canadian wine in the UK, but what we do see can be very impressive. What would your tips be on what we and our listeners should be looking out for and trying to buy?
Well, I think our specialties are Riesling and Pinot Noir. Ice wine, of course, is a given. It's what we're known for. Luscious, golden elixir dessert wine. But Riesling and Pinot Noir thrive, as you know, Susie, in a cool climate. And we do them so well. They have that nervy, edgy acidity, that vibrancy, that aliveness in the glass that I think makes them wonderful, either on their own or as food partners. So those are the wines that I would look for.
And in terms of Riesling, do they tend to? I'm not familiar at all with Canadian Riesling. I'm going to admit that freely. Do they tend to be dry or semi-sweet or a mix of the two?
They tend to be either dry or just slightly off dry. So there aren't a lot of really sweet styles unless you jump all the way to ice wine. So you'll tend to get fairly dry versions here.
So coming back to you, Natalie, and your personal experiences, I mean, to be fair, wine and alcohol haven't always been a panacea for you. You mentioned before that your father was an alcoholic. How do you think that experience has shaped your approach to wine?
It's had a profound influence. So I grew up in a Scottish East Coast family where wine wasn't even part of the table. It was beer and whiskey. Not that I was drinking it as a child, but wine wasn't part of the culture. And so it wasn't until I got into university, even post university, that I really started to get into wine and appreciate it. And I think knowing that there is an allure to wine beyond all of the sort of heady topics we talk about, the way it intersects with so many fascinating subjects. There's also the pure buzz of it. And so that I like to say that's the reason we don't have orange juice critics. There's something magical about wine and the way it ties everything together and the way it sort of illuminates all of our senses, including those that love the buzz. And so having a father who was an alcoholic really made me acutely aware of moderation and so on. And I believe now what you know and love and truly understand, you don't abuse. And what I mean by that is if you can gain an appreciation for wine, if you can learn about it, I think you can make your way to moderation through that appreciation. It's why I teach wine and food pairing classes online as well.
I know. I was going to ask you. That's beautifully put. But I was just going to touch a bit further on your family. Your mother and grandmother were teachers,
Yes.
and a big part of what you do is teaching online, particularly food and wine pairing classes. How has the pandemic changed sort of what you do and how people are engaging with it?
The pandemic has, I think, made many of us search for ways that we can use our time at home, not just more productively, but more enjoyably, since we're missing those experiences of going out to restaurants and travel and so on. We want to kind of elevate the food and wine experience as much as we can at home. And so what I've noticed is a real uptick on just overall numbers in terms of people enrolling in my courses, but also different people enrolling in them. So what I used to get were a lot of people who couldn't commit to that one night a week, a physical course. Maybe it was because they had kids and they needed the flexibility to stay home or go at their own pace. Perhaps it was, people who traveled a lot for business. I get lots of people checking in from hotel rooms and using the minibar and taking my courses that way. But now it's a much wider or broader swath of people who are looking to take these courses online. And I think it's because they had to get over the mental hurdle that taking wine classes online is something that can be not only effective, but it can be as or more enjoyable than in person. There's some things, of course, we can't replace about in-person tasting, but there's so many more things, advantages to online courses, whether it is that flexibility or the ability to connect with people around the world who share your passion. So I'm getting a lot more of those people. And then the last group, I would say, I'm getting a lot more of people from the hospitality industry, furloughed or otherwise, who want to sharpen their pairing skills so that they're better able to earn a living when they do get back to working in restaurants.
Now, on that note, actually, the whole food and wine pairing note. I mean, there are people who say it's sophistry, it's smoke and mirrors, a load of old rubbish. What is your response to that?
Well, I think they are certainly entitled to their opinions, even if I don't agree with them, obviously. But I think food is a lot less intimidating than wine. So I think we go into a grocery store and we look at roast chicken and we don't start worrying about, oh, which roast chicken am I going to buy? I mean, where did that chicken grow up? Is that chicken from free range or whatever? I mean, perhaps it's because the choices aren't as great as they are in wine. But I think we can bring more people to wine through food first. And that's what I try to do in the courses, but also just on my website, because I think if you know what you love, your taste in food, you can start to explore your taste in wine through those flavors that you're confident of when it comes to eating food.
Yeah, and I suppose most of us would drink wine with food anyway, so it makes total
Yeah.
sense to put the two together. And I mean, you have written an awful lot about food and wine, so I'm just wondering what would be your dream food and wine experience. I mean, if you could do anything, anywhere, with anyone, absolutely anything, any food and wine, what would it be?
Oh my goodness. Well, I've been fortunate to have interviewed um, some of the most renowned winemakers in the world, including Aubert de Villaine at Domaine de Romanée-Conti, and that was pretty spectacular. I'm not quite sure how I would top his Burgundian Pinot Noir, but I'd love to have another bottle. He could just maybe send it
You
to
could
me. It
just
doesn't
send you
have to
one
be
over.
there. Yeah, exactly. That would be great.
Bottle of
And
La
then I
Tâche, thank you.
exactly. I'm not fussy. It's okay. Even a bad vintage Aubert, it's okay. Don't worry. But I'd probably crack it open with my partner Miles and just have an evening of binge watching our latest favorite show on Netflix.
And food? Would you go for food?
I'm not sure if I would just pair that DRC with more DRC. Maybe Aubert could send 2 bottles if that's not asking too much. But sure. Miles is a great cook. I don't cook, but fortunately he does. So one of his dishes that might pair well with a Pinot Noir, like a veal or ossobuco, something like that, something comforting while
That
we
you could
watch.
sink into. So
Exactly.
coming back down to earth a little bit, if you could recommend just one really easy and fun food and wine combination for our listeners to try out, what would it be?
Well, I like to suggest things that are pairings that don't even require cooking because I'm not a cook myself. So there are so many different types of cheeses that go so beautifully with wine, and the combinations are almost infinite. So I would suggest get 3 of your favorite cheeses, like a creamy cheese, a brie, a cheddar, maybe a blue, whatever it is you like, and maybe crack open a wine or two, depends on how many people are there, and then just mix and match, and you will be amazed at the flavor combinations you'll get. And one tip I always say is make sure you try the wine first, then go to the food. You can have the wine in your mouth at the same time if you want to. And then afterwards, go back to the wine. And what happened to the wine? And a lot of people will say, oh my gosh, it's completely changed. It's smoothed out or something happened. And of course, we know the wine hasn't changed, but your perception of it has changed. And that's magical for a lot of people to discover that.
Absolutely. So what's the weirdest food and wine pairing you've ever had?
Okay, I think this is a truly Canadian weird pairing. We have ketchup chips here. I'm not sure if you have ketchup chips in
We have ketchup
England.
and we
Oh,
have chips,
okay,
but
don't
I'm
do
not
that.
sure we have ketchup chips.
No, exactly.
And
Okay.
also our chips, I'm referring to sort of something that's potato that's
Yes.
cut and cooked. Because I know that I've had this experience abroad before where somebody said, "Would you like chips?" And I end up with a packet of crisps.
Oh,
Um,
it's
so
crisps. You're
yes,
right.
so
Okay. Yeah,
it's different interpretation of chips.
there you go. So I'm talking about ketchup crisps then. So
Ah,
crisps or chips are chips that are flavored with ketchup. And
wow.
I have a weakness for ketchup chips. And it's it's Achilles heel. But I thought, well, I know that ketchup, commercial ketchup, is said to have more sugar than ice cream. So I thought, well, ketchup chips, they're going to be sweet. They're going to ruin any dry wine. So, but I thought, oh, well, for the sake of my readers, listeners, course students, I'm going to try different wines. And what I discovered to my surprise is that these ketchup chips went beautifully with a dry rosé. And the ketchup chips weren't as sweet as I thought. And the sort of strawberry berry flavors of the chips went really well with ketchup. Now, I don't advise trying to eat, slather ketchup over French fries or crisps for that matter, and a dry wine. I think that would be just cruel to your mouth. But this combination worked and it was completely weird and I loved it.
I think we're going to have to get Peter's favorite crisps are sweet chili, which is sort
Oh,
of similar. They've got a sort of a slightly sweet tomatoey flavor to them. So
yes.
maybe I'll get him to crack open a bottle of rosé and he can try those together and see what he thinks.
I want to know how that goes.
So finally, I mean, it's not just food that this is on food and wine pairing. It's not just food that you pair with wine, is it? You give us a sense of some of the other things that you like to pair with wine.
We love to pair wine with music, especially while Miles is cooking and I'm pulling corks. And I'll read him bits and pieces of the latest newspaper or magazine. We love to pair it, of course, with binge watching Netflix. So we're binge watching, not binge drinking. But there's so many shows on it. I think, you know, we've spent a lot of time doing that during COVID. But, we love sitting out just in the backyard and watching the sunset. I mean, as cliche as that might sound, I just think wine can infuse so many ordinary activities with some sort of special warmth that I think layers in those memories even more, like that cabin in the woods. I think there's just something because you're touching on so many more senses, not just the visual of watching the sunset, but you're tasting, you're feeling the wine, it's seeping through your body. And I think that's what makes memories.
So you've said, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, but you've said that one of the things you do is to help people do is to become an expert in their own taste. What do you mean by that, and how do you go about doing it?
Well, I recall the book when my son Ryan was born. One of the books I read was it by Dr. Ferber, To Get Your Baby to Sleep, or one of those books and what the advice was, you know more than you think you know. And you can tell someone that, and they'll say, okay, fine, you're trying to reassure me, but it's true. So again, I am not a cook. I'm going to make a metaphor here, a comparison that will probably fail horribly. But I think if you know some of the fundamentals of cooking, you know how to saute or braise or boil or fry, then I think if you've got those building blocks, you're more likely to try a new recipe because you think, oh, I know how I could make that or how I could adjust that. So if you have the fundamental building blocks of how to taste wine, what are the major flavors, kind of what pairs with what, I think you're more apt to experiment. And it's the experimenting that will teach you to be an expert on your own palate so that you will go out there, be a bit more adventurous than you have in the past, and find new flavors, new wines, new regions that you love.
Now, you host, Natalie, your own brilliant podcast. We love it,
Thank you.
Unreserved Wine Talk. Why did you decide to start a podcast? I mean, was this a long time ago? I think it probably was, wasn't it?
I started near the end of 2018, so it's been almost 2 years, I guess. But my love of the human voice goes back a lot further back than that. It probably starts with my mother reading to me every night bedtime stories, and I'd feel drowsy, and all I would hear is her voice. So I was imagining the characters of the book as I got sleepier and sleepier. But then, even as a teenager, I would listen to satellite radio and it would sort of blow in and out across the Atlantic. I was listening to the BBC, Susie, and I just loved their reporting and this whole other world they were talking about. And I thought, I'm just, imagining it at night, because that's when the reception was strongest. So I've always loved um, the medium, I guess, of the human voice. It's very intimate, as you know, you're millimeters away from someone's brain, your voice. It's like in the dark pillow talk. And so that drew me to it. But I didn't get started until about 2018. I think because I had so many other projects on the go, it was always in the back of my mind. But the driving force was definitely that love of the voice.
And so tell me, now you have your own podcast. Tell me something that you particularly love and equally perhaps don't like so much about podcasting.
I love that it allows me to be nosy. So I'm an introvert and I ask questions on podcasts that I would not ask at a dinner party, even an impolite dinner party. So I just wouldn't open up that way. And so I love that it allows me into people's lives in a much more like a deeper, more meaningful connection. The conversations you can have on a podcast are just so beyond, oh, what's the weather and so on, as you know. And I think I'm also making up for lost time because I was such an introvert as a child, spent so many hours or years in the corner, not talking at parties, that now I'm making up for it for sure. In terms of what I found to be a challenge or don't like about podcasting is we're in a very technical field, you could say, Susie, in that you can get a lot of the facts wrong. um, about wine, from whatever, the type of oak to whatever. I don't focus on the technical aspects of wine on my podcast, um, because I love storytelling and I love to get to people's stories. But that said, there's a minefield of facts you can get wrong. And so what I had to do is get past my own fear of looking stupid, or my own fear of what will people think. She's been writing about wine for 20 years and she doesn't know that. And so, I have to retreat into, um, or reassure myself that I always will be an enthusiastic amateur, and that's the best service I can be for my listener. Lots of my listeners won't know those facts either.
No, I think also, with wine, if there's one thing wine teaches you, it's to be humble, because
Mm.
frankly, we all get things wrong every day. And it can be something that you think, I know that. And how did I manage to get that wrong? That's ridiculous. Or you might not know. I mean, there's so many things. How could you ever know everything about wine? So I think that's a really good point. And guess we just have to be more relaxed about it and say, do you know, I got it wrong. It's not the end of the world.
Exactly. And when you do, I think you can establish even more rapport with your audience.
I think so,
People,
because we're all
yeah,
human, aren't we?
we're human and we don't identify with perfection. I mean, it's the redemption stories we look for. Now, this is not
Yeah.
a redemption story getting the wrong type of oak on a Shiraz, but people identify with that imperfection.
They do. And I guess though, where you're probably never imperfect is when you're writing your books. And I just wanted to briefly ask you about that. You've already written 2 books. You're on your 3rd book now, which is a memoir. How is it different then from your 2 previous books, and what can we expect?
Well, it's a memoir is a different type of animal. I've learned in trying to write this one, or as I still progress in writing it, in that, of course, it's very personal. The first 2 books I did write from a first person perspective. They were all stories about gallivanting around the world and meeting odd winemakers and learning about wine through their stories. But now, I'm turning the camera on myself. That's what a memoir is. And it's very exposing. It can make you feel very vulnerable. But I think that's a good challenge, to try to understand who you are and why you did what you did. And I think people can still learn lots about wine, but now it's from a much more intimate perspective. And the one thing that I had to learn was almost thinking about it like a movie script. So you have your opening shot or your establishing shot. You have to think in scenes as opposed to just one long exposition of, I did this, I did that. Like, no one wants to read that. People want to be engaged almost as though they're watching a movie. So even if they don't know you, they can identify with conflict. During this book, I got divorced. During this book, I suffered from depression. During this book, I had to deal with alcohol consumption. And so those major themes are just human themes, but trying to shape the narrative as scene after scene after scene, as opposed to one long explanation, is the challenge.
So finally, if you could give one tip to our listeners, what would it be?
Wow, just keep experimenting. So, one of the things that I advise my students to do is, when you go into a liquor store, I know it can be intimidating, but just buy a mixed case of wines instead of always trying to find the one perfect wine or the one perfect pairing. And don't be afraid to ask the liquor store staff. Say, I like this particular Rhone Syrah. What would you recommend in this price range, in this style? And maybe they'll take you to, who knows, an Argentine Malbec, or and just broaden your horizons, or maybe different wineries in the Rhone, and just de-risk the whole thing by getting a mixed case, and then experiment and find some new favorites.
So is there anything else that you'd like to add now, Natalie, that we haven't covered?
I just welcome everyone to join me if they like, not only on the podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk, but also I go live on Facebook and Instagram every Wednesday evening. And that's a free open call to anyone who wants to come crack open a bottle or a glass of wine. And we just talk about the latest news in the wine world, our favorite pairings. We exchange tips. It's like a virtual kitchen table. And so
And that's
they can find me.
where do people find you online?
So my website is the hub of everything I do. So it's just my name, nataliemclean.com, and they can find me there. They can find me on all the social channels, but my website is probably the place to go to find me elsewhere.
Natalie McLean, thank you so much for listening. Oh, I'm going to have to do that again, Natalie, because I managed to fudge your name and what various other things. I'm going to take a
No,
break and say it.
no worries.
Natalie McLean, thank you so much for talking to us.
Oh, Susie, this was a pure delight. I just loved our conversation, and I hope that you and Peter and I and Miles, I'll bring him too, can get together and maybe share those bottles of DRC.